Hello, my name is Lakritia Cox, and I am a descendant of a town called Lynch, Kentucky, in Eastern Kentucky. And I have the privilege of serving as a co-president of the SACA, which is the Southeastern Kentucky Heritage Association. This year, we are celebrating our 49th annual Eastern Kentucky Social Club reunion. And I've been coming to these reunions since I've been a child. To see them year after year is pretty amazing. I think when I talk about this, people assume that it's a family reunion, and I tell them, no, it's much more than that. And so when I discuss with them what it is that we're doing, how my grandfather was a coal miner, and how we have such a rich history, they're pretty shocked. The first thing that I get, well, I didn't know they were black coal miners. And then I just talked to them about my grandfather in this town in Lynch. It's wonderful to go back. Actually, I haven't been back in a while after my grandparents have deceased. But just to have this reunion and this experience just brings hope to generations to come. And so that's why we decided to start the chapter in St. Louis. I was at a reunion back in Atlanta, and we kept saying we have to get our youth engaged and we need new chapters, young blood. And I said, hey, why don't we just start a chapter in St. Louis? And right now we're seeing the first fruits of that. We are hosting our very first reunion. So I'm so excited to see people engage. We decided to bring back an exhibit this year where Karita Brown, discussed the history and the heritage of black coal miners. And I'm just really looking forward to see what more comes out of that as we begin to share our history with the United States, because I feel like there's so little known about that area or that region. I mean, even though there are coal miners in West Virginia as well, I think that, Lynch and towns like that are very unique because you just see, it was almost like a melting pot because it was so diverse. You had, labored skilled workers as coal miners that were black. And during that time, I know my grandparents, they migrated up from Alabama, and just to see the town booming and see the decline of that and see where actually the baby boomer generation just go off to look for jobs and then migrate to Cleveland and migrate to places like Detroit and New York, Philadelphia, and so forth, and for them to come back and see just how successful they are. And that's always been something that has been very eye-opening to me. So I just wanted to take the time to share with you because we plan on continuing on with the heritage and the traditions of Eastern Kentucky, even though we don't live there, is very much alive in our hearts. Well, my grandfather, his name is Levy Eaton. I do know that he was a coal miner. When I met him, he was no longer a coal miner. But he just was, I know that he was a Mason as well about him. And we loved to play games. That's something about my grandfather. He loved playing games with all of his grandkids. I loved going to Lynch because we'd go rock climbing, and my grandfather would take every one of his grandkids on a walk. And I'd always be afraid because if you know anything about Lynch, there are a lot of snakes, and I'd always be afraid of snakes. And he would tell us stories. He liked to tell big stories and say, oh, if I get, it's a myth though, if I get bit by a snake, I want you to suck the venom out. And I'm like, no, Granddad, I don't want to do that. But I do love, just to climb on, big rocks and just look over, and just see the cars which look like ants. It was just like, I like to hike just because of that. I like to go on walks just from that experience of being a young kid. My grandmother, I heard that she was a very stern woman. I loved her. Her name was, I didn't love her. I love her just from the stories. Her name was Ethel. She passed on before I was born, but I did have a wonderful grandmother who I know as grandmother, but who's actually my step-grandmother, Margie, and she was great. She could ride up and down those mountains so fast, and where I would be afraid, she had no fear. So it's a family of 6, and each and one of my uncles and my aunts who are all a part of this chapter here today in St. Louis, even though we live everywhere. It's an experience for us to relive and just honor our grandparents and their father and all the hard work that they've done just to support us. And I very much love to just have that. Sure, it's funny. They all ended up, not all of them, yeah, my uncle moved to Massachusetts. And I did have an aunt that went to New York, I'm sorry. But they ended up back in Springfield, Massachusetts, just because he got a good job there. And then he was able to get them jobs while they were there. And you wouldn't think of a place called Springfield, Massachusetts. And there my parents met because my dad was in the military, and so and he was from St. Louis, so that's how I ended up in St. Louis, and my mother. My other uncle, a lot of them just went straight to the military, a lot of my uncles that are from there, and so after they went to the military, they ended up in different cities. Some of them stayed and made the military their career, and others just I know went on to be professors. You hear all these stories about them just being really successful on out. So there was a lot of opportunity, though, for them at that time in the cities that they chose to go in. So I had a couple that lived in California, and then they were a part of the California chapter of the Eastern Kentucky Social Club. Then some that were in Atlanta, and then they were a part of that chapter as well. And then once they moved again and we created this one, now we're all a part of St. Louis, even though some live in Texas and some live in Philadelphia, but we're all a family, so we all stick together. Yeah, I think what stands out to me the most, probably at a young age, is still the banquet, and we do that now. And it's more like a gala that you see at places now. But the keynote speakers, if there was a really good keynote speaker, I think that stood out to me. And I love music. It was always, whether or not they were a band, but just the different cities that we went to as a young child. A lot of kids aren't exposed to going to all these different cities when they're young, so I was grateful for the exposure. And, just being in Atlanta when I was young by going to, black football game, college football games, and just the different excursions, going to that was later on, going to jazz festivals and different things. It was just fun and just meeting new people. That's how I have these relationships with these people now, because I met them when I was young and they feel like family. So I believe these reunions are important. It's kind of unique. I know all of my parents, my mother's, who's from there, her classmates. That's unusual, and they get together at this time, and it's just like you're building and creating relationships. And I think that's something that our community now, the African American community now, that relationship, that family base, just being strong, we miss that. And so I think these reunions just bring light to the community that African Americans used to have, and it gives you hope that it can continue to grow and be that way. Don't always share your history. I think that was key for me as a young kid, that my parents, their stories, they loved the area. They always share the history with us. And no matter what you experience, if we continue to share with our kids, like my daughter, I share with her now, she knows what lynch is, she knows the community. Even though she hasn't been there, she wrote a poem and she said, I'm a descendant of lynch, is because it's something that's important to us. And I just encourage anyone from any place, just always share your history.